I drove 5 grueling hours through freezing sleet, clutching 3 intricate homemade pies and a $200 bottle of wine just to have the front door shut in my face. My sister looked me dead in the eye and said she never invited me. So, I destroyed her perfect Thanksgiving. Here's how. To understand how a family gets to the point of a driveway screaming match on a national holiday, you have to understand the dynamic between my older sister, Stephanie, and me. For as long as I can remember, Stephanie has been the indisputable sun around which our entire family orbits. I, on the other hand, am just Pluto barely acknowledged, mostly forgotten, and occasionally debated over whether I even belong in the system at all. I'm 28, living in a cramped but cozy apartment in Boston, working grueling hours as a junior architect. I make a decent living, but I'm certainly not wealthy. Stephanie, 32, is married to Richard. Richard is the heir to a boutique wealth management firm in Connecticut. They live in a sprawling 6-bedroom colonial in Westport that looks like it was ripped straight out of a Pottery Barn catalog. Our mother, Brenda, has spent her entire life curating the perfect image. When Stephanie married into real money, my mother practically moved into their guest house. My dad, Dave, is a passive man who prefers the garage to family conflict, meaning my mother goes unchecked. I've spent my entire adult life trying to earn a fraction of the approval my mother showers on Stephanie, often bending over backward just to feel like I belong in my own family. This year had been particularly brutal for me. In October, my long-term boyfriend Colin and I went through a devastating breakup. I was living alone, emotionally hollowed out, and dreading the upcoming holidays. I hadn't been home for Thanksgiving in 2 years due to work, but this year, I cleared my schedule. I needed my family. I needed the noise, the chaos, and the comfort of tradition. 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, the family group chat lit up. Stephanie sent a message. Hosting Thanksgiving this year at the new house, 2 p.m. Don't forget Grandma Betty's brown butter pecan pies, Chloe. Need at least 3. My heart swelled. Grandma Betty was my dad's mother, and I was the only one who had bothered to learn her notoriously difficult pie recipe before she passed away. The crust had to be chilled perfectly. The brown butter had to be watched like a hawk so it wouldn't burn. It was a labor of love. The fact that Stephanie specifically requested them and implicitly invited me felt like an olive branch. I threw myself into preparation. On Tuesday evening, I spent nearly $100 on premium ingredients: European butter, fresh organic pecans, Madagascar vanilla bean paste. I spent all of Wednesday night baking, my small kitchen coated in flour and the rich scent of caramelized sugar. I boxed the 3 pies in beautiful bakery boxes tied with baker's twine. I even splurged on a $200 bottle of Chateauneuf du Pape, knowing Richard was a wine snob and wanting to impress his family. I was excited. For the first time in months, I felt a genuine spark of joy. Thanksgiving morning arrived, cold and bitter. A massive storm front was sweeping across New England, bringing a treacherous mix of rain, sleet, and dropping temperatures. Google Maps showed the drive from Boston to Westport at a solid 3 hours on a good day. Today, it was flashing blood red along the entire I-90 corridor. The estimated travel time was 5 hours. I loaded up my 10-year-old Honda Civic. The heater in my car only works on one side, and the windshield wipers were fighting a losing battle against the freezing rain. The drive was a nightmare. Cars were spun out in the median. Traffic slowed to a painful crawl near Hartford. My hands were gripped so tightly around the steering wheel that my knuckles turned stark white. Every time I hit a patch of black ice, my stomach dropped, but I kept going. I kept picturing the warmth of Stephanie's massive fireplace, the smell of roasted turkey, and the rare, approving smile from my mother when I walked in with the wine and the pies. I didn't stop for food. I barely stopped to use the restroom. I just pushed through the exhaustion and the weather, listening to the rhythmic thump-thump of the wipers. By the time I finally pulled off the Westport exit, I was shivering, exhausted, and running on nothing but a cup of lukewarm gas station coffee. I navigated through Stephanie's ultra-exclusive neighborhood. Massive, manicured lawns were blanketed in a fresh, pristine layer of frost. When I reached her street, my heart sank slightly. Her massive circular driveway was completely packed. There were 3 Range Rovers, a sleek black Mercedes, and my parents' Lexus. There was no room for my battered little Honda. I had to park 2 blocks down the street, on a steep incline, practically in a drainage ditch. The wind howled as I stepped out of the car, instantly freezing my toes in my leather boots. I carefully balanced the stack of 3 pie boxes in my left arm and clutched the expensive bottle of wine in my right hand. I began the long, freezing walk back up the street, the sleet stinging my cheeks like tiny needles. But I was smiling. I was finally here. I survived the drive. I was going to be with my family. By the time I reached Stephanie's grand front porch, I was completely out of breath. My hair was plastered to my forehead from the sleet, and my coat was soaked through. I balanced the boxes on my knee and pressed the glowing Ring doorbell. Through the massive glass sidelights, I could see the glow of the foyer chandelier. I heard laughter, elegant, tinkling laughter, accompanied by the soft strumming of a jazz track playing on hidden speakers. The heavy mahogany door swung open. It wasn't Stephanie, but Richard. He was wearing a tailored navy blazer and a crisp white shirt, holding a crystal tumbler of scotch. The smile on his face immediately evaporated when he saw me standing there, dripping wet on his welcome mat. "Chloe," he said, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "What? What are you doing here?" My smile faltered. "Hey, Richard. Happy Thanksgiving. I brought the pies and some wine. It is freezing out there. Can I come in?" I moved to step inside, but Richard didn't budge. He awkwardly blocked the threshold, his eyes darting back over his shoulder toward the living room. Let me go get Steph." He left the door cracked open. The blast of warm, cinnamon-scented air hit my freezing face, but the chill in my chest had nothing to do with the weather. Something was very wrong. A moment later, Stephanie appeared. She looked flawless. She was wearing a cream-colored silk blouse and high-waisted tailored trousers, her hair blown out into perfect, bouncy waves. Behind her, I caught a glimpse into the formal dining room. The table was set with fine china, crystal goblets, and massive floral centerpieces. Sitting around the table were Richard's parents, Arthur and Eleanor, along with Richard's sister, her husband, and a few other people I didn't recognize. It was a highly curated, black-tie adjacent affair. Stephanie pulled the front door open just a few inches wider, stepping into the gap so I couldn't see past her. Her eyes dropped to my wet boots, then to the pie boxes in my arms. "Chloe, what are you doing here?" she hissed, keeping her voice low so the guests wouldn't hear. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling from the cold. "It's Thanksgiving. I drove 5 hours in the sleet. I brought Grandma's pies, just like you asked." Stephanie let out a harsh, exasperated sigh. She rubbed her temples as if I were giving her a massive migraine. "Chloe, I didn't invite you." The words hung in the freezing air. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, waiting for her to laugh, pull me inside, and tell me she was joking. But her face was stone cold. "What are you talking about?" I stammered. "You sent a message in the group chat. You literally said, 'Hosting Thanksgiving, don't forget the pies, Chloe.'" "Yes," Stephanie snapped, looking at me like I was an idiot. "I asked for the pies. I didn't say you were invited to stay. Richard's family is here. The Hastings are very particular, and this is an extremely intimate, formal sit-down dinner. We don't even have a seat set for you." I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands, gripping the baker's twine, went entirely numb. You asked me to bake 3 complicated pies, drive 5 hours through a winter storm, just to drop them off at your door like an Uber Eats driver? "Don't be dramatic," Stephanie whispered viciously, glancing back at the dining room. "I assumed you would drop them off with Mom and Dad yesterday, and they would bring them. Why would you drive all the way here on the actual day? You don't fit in with this crowd, Chloe. You know that. Look at you, you're soaking wet and wearing a chunky sweater. This is a catered event." Before I could respond, my mother appeared behind Stephanie. Brenda was wearing a stunning emerald green dress, her neck draped in pearls. When she saw me standing on the porch, she didn't look happy to see her youngest daughter. She looked terrified that the Hastings might notice me. "Chloe," my mother scolded, squeezing past Stephanie to step onto the freezing porch, pulling the door almost entirely shut behind her. "Keep your voice down! Eleanor is right inside." "Mom," I gasped, the tears finally mixing with the sleet on my face. "Did you know about this? Did you know she only wanted the food and not me?" My mother refused to meet my eyes. She smoothed down the front of her dress. "Chloe, please try to understand. Stephanie is under a lot of pressure to impress Richard's parents. They are very important people." We just didn't think it was appropriate for you to be here this year. You've been so depressed since Colin left you, and you're just not great in social situations right now. We didn't want you bringing the mood down. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. I spent 2 days baking. I spent hundreds of dollars. I drove for 5 hours. I haven't eaten all day. Well, that was a silly misunderstanding on your part, my mother said dismissively. She reached out toward my hands. Just give me the pies, sweetheart. I'll make sure everybody knows you made them. Well, actually, Stephanie already told Eleanor that she learned Grandma's recipe, so let's just keep that between us. Give me the boxes. You can drive back home before the roads get worse. I took a step back, pulling the pies away from her reaching hands. Wait, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, terrifyingly calm register. Stephanie told her in-laws that she baked these pies? Stephanie peeked her head out the door again. Just give her the food, Chloe. Stop making a scene. I'll Venmo you for the ingredients if you're going to be this petty about it. I looked at my sister, perched in her warm, million-dollar mansion. I looked at my mother, who was willing to cast me out into a literal freezing storm so she could play pretend with rich people. I looked past them, through the window, where I could see my dad sitting by the fire, drinking a beer, totally oblivious or deliberately ignoring what was happening on the front porch. For 28 years, I had swallowed my pride. I had taken the scraps of affection they threw my way. I had smiled through the insults, the exclusions, and the blatant favoritism. I had let them treat me like a servant in my own family. But out here, shivering in the freezing Connecticut sleet, looking at the two women who were supposed to love me unconditionally, something inside me finally snapped. It wasn't a loud, explosive snap. It was a quiet, profound fracturing of the chains that had kept me bound to them my entire life. You want the pies? I asked softly. Yes, obviously, Stephanie sighed. Eleanor has been asking about dessert. Okay, I said. I looked at the top box. I looked at my sister's perfectly manicured lawn, currently covered in pristine white frost. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, I turned my hands over and let the first box drop. Smack! The delicate crust shattered against the frozen pavement. The rich, sticky brown butter pecan filling splattered across the stone steps. Stephanie gasped, a loud, ugly sound. Chloe, what the hell are you doing? Dropping off the pies, I said, my voice deadpan. I took the second box. I raised it to chest height, locked eyes with my mother, and dropped it. Splat! Pecans rolled across the porch. The gooey filling coated the toe of my mother's expensive Italian leather heels. Brenda shrieked, jumping back. Are you insane? Have you lost your mind? I didn't answer. I held the third box, the one I had spent 3 extra hours on, hand crimping the edges perfectly. I turned toward the massive stone pillar of her front porch. I pulled my arm back, and I threw the box like a frisbee directly into the stonework. It exploded in a shower of pie crust and sticky syrup, leaving a massive, dark, greasy stain right at eye level next to her front door. Oh my God, Stephanie shrieked, throwing the front door wide open. The jazz music spilled out, along with the shocked faces of Richard, Eleanor, and Arthur, who had all rushed to the foyer at the sound of the screaming. What is going on out here? Eleanor gasped, clutching her chest, looking horrified at the massacre of baked goods on the porch. I stood there, breathing heavily, the empty pie boxes at my feet. I held up the $200 bottle of Chateauneuf du Pape. Stephanie looked terrified. Chloe, do not. I stood at the bottom of the porch steps, the sleet turning my hair into a frozen helmet, clutching the neck of the $200 bottle of Chateauneuf du Pape. Stephanie's eyes were wide with genuine terror, darting between the expensive bottle in my hand and her horrified in-laws standing in the foyer. Eleanor Hastings, a woman who looked like she had never spoken louder than a golf clap murmur in her entire life, was clutching the lapels of her cashmere cardigan. Richard stood rigidly beside her, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. Chloe, put the bottle down, Richard barked, stepping forward. You've made your point. You're acting like a complete lunatic. My parents are here. I know they're here, Richard, I said, my voice shockingly steady over the howling wind. I didn't throw the wine. Instead, I walked right up the steps, my boots crunching over the ruined remains of the brown butter crust, and shoved the bottle directly into Eleanor's trembling hands. Happy Thanksgiving, Mrs. Hastings, I said, forcing a polite frozen smile. It's a 2015 vintage. I bought it specifically for you and Arthur, because I know you appreciate a good robust red. I would love to stay and pour you a glass, but apparently, I wasn't invited. Eleanor stared at the bottle, then looked at me, her sharp eyes taking in my soaked clothes, my shivering frame, and the sheer devastation on the porch. What do you mean you weren't invited? Stephanie told us her lovely younger sister was coming down with a dreadful flu and couldn't make the drive. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed off the brick exterior. A dreadful flu? No, Eleanor. I drove 5 hours through a winter storm. I spent 2 days hand-crimping those pies. I pointed to the greasy, sugary mess splattered against the stone pillar, the pies that Stephanie told you she baked. Let me guess. She said she spent all morning perfecting Grandma Betty's recipe? Eleanor slowly turned her head to look at Stephanie. The silence in the foyer was deafening. Stephanie? Eleanor's voice was dangerously quiet. Did you lie to me? Stephanie's perfect facade crumbled. She stammered, her face turning a blotchy red. No, I helped prep the ingredients. Chloe is just being hysterical because she's going through a tough breakup and she's projecting her misery onto our holiday. I baked them alone in my apartment in Boston. Stephanie, I corrected, my tone icy. You haven't touched an oven since you nearly burned down Mom's kitchen in 2014. You didn't invite me today because I'm just a junior architect in a chunky sweater, and I don't fit the wealthy country club aesthetic you're trying to sell to your in-laws. That is enough, my mother, Brenda, suddenly screeched. She stepped forward, trying to physically push me back out into the cold. Chloe, you are embarrassing this family. You are ruining Thanksgiving. Get in your car and go home right now. She's not going anywhere. A deep, booming voice echoed from the back of the house. Everyone froze. Pushing his way through the crowd of well-dressed guests was my father, Dave. For my entire life, my dad had been the king of conflict avoidance. He was the man who went to the garage to tinker with his tools the second my mother raised her voice. But right now, he wasn't looking at his shoes. He was looking at me, standing shivering in the sleet, and then he looked at the wreckage of the pies. Dave, go back to the living room, Brenda hissed, her eyes darting nervously toward Arthur Hastings, who was watching the scene unfold with intense, judgmental fascination. No, my dad said, stepping out onto the freezing porch in just his button-down shirt. He looked at my mother with a level of disgust I had never seen on his face. Brenda, what the hell is wrong with you? Our daughter drove 5 hours in a literal ice storm, and you're trying to lock her out on the porch? She wasn't invited, Brenda argued, dropping her voice to a frantic whisper. It's a seated dinner for 12, Dave. The caterers only brought enough squab for 12. My dad stared at her, as if he were looking at a complete stranger. She's your daughter. She's standing in the freezing rain. You'd rather protect a plate of pigeon than let your own child inside? He turned to Stephanie, who was now crying actual tears, not of guilt, but of humiliation. And you, my dad said, pointing a thick, calloused finger at his golden child. You used your sister for free labor, stole her credit, and then told your in-laws she was sick? You are a selfish, spoiled brat, Stephanie. You always have been, and your mother enabled every second of it. Dad, Stephanie gasped, clutching her chest. You're embarrassing me in front of Richard's family. You embarrassed yourself, Eleanor Hastings interjected smoothly. The wealthy matriarch set the bottle of wine down on the console table. She looked at Stephanie with an expression of pure, unadulterated disdain. I can tolerate a lot of things, Stephanie, but I cannot tolerate a liar. And I certainly cannot tolerate a woman who treats her own flesh and blood like the hired help. Eleanor turned to her husband. Arthur, get the coats. We are leaving. The foyer erupted into absolute chaos. Richard began pleading with his parents. Stephanie burst into loud, hysterical sobs, grabbing her mother-in-law's arm, only for Eleanor to firmly shake her off. Brenda was pacing in circles, hyperventilating about the ruined dinner and the social suicide that was currently taking place in the 06880 zip code. But I just stood there. The heavy weight that had been sitting on my chest for 28 years, the need for their approval, the desperate desire to be seen and loved by them, simply vanished. I felt lighter than air. I'll see you later, Dad, I said softly, turning away from the screaming match and stepping back out into the driving sleet. Hold on, my dad called out. I stopped at the edge of the driveway. I watched as my father reached into the foyer closet, pulled out his heavy winter coat, and grabbed his keys from the bowl. "Dave, where are you going?" Brenda screamed, her voice cracking in panic. "The Hastings are leaving. You can't leave too." "Watch me," my dad replied. He didn't even look back at her. He walked down the porch steps, stepping right over the smashed pie crusts, and wrapped his heavy, warm arm around my shivering shoulders. "Let's go get some real food, kiddo," he said. The drive away from Stephanie's neighborhood was slow, but I didn't care about the ice on the roads anymore. My heater was still broken on the passenger side, so my dad and I huddled in our coats, the defroster blasting on high. We drove for 20 minutes until we found the only place open on Thanksgiving night, in the middle of a sleet storm. A rundown, brightly lit diner right off the interstate. We sat in a sticky vinyl booth by the window, watching the sleet bounce off the neon sign outside. We ordered 2 plates of meatloaf, instant mashed potatoes, and a massive plate of greasy disco fries. It was the furthest thing from the Michelin star-catered dinner waiting back at Stephanie's mansion. But as I took a bite of a cold, gravy-soaked fry, I realized it was the best Thanksgiving meal I had ever had. My dad and I talked for hours. For the first time in my life, he apologized. He apologized for taking the easy way out for decades. He apologized for letting my mother's obsession with image dictate my childhood, and he apologized for not protecting me from Stephanie's cruelty. Sitting in that diner, drinking terrible, burnt coffee, I finally got the father I had always needed. The fallout from that day was biblical. Stephanie's perfect marriage took a massive hit. The Hastings, who valued loyalty and honesty above all else, were thoroughly disgusted by the display on the porch. Eleanor, a prominent socialite, didn't keep the story to herself. By Christmas, half of their country club knew that Stephanie had locked her sister out in a storm over a seating arrangement. Richard, embarrassed by his wife's newly tarnished reputation, grew distant. They are currently in couples counseling, though, from what I hear, it's not going well. As for my mother, the incident broke something fundamental between her and my dad. Dave refused to go back to the house in Westport. He stayed at a motel for a week before renting his own apartment. After 30 years of marriage, my dad filed for divorce in late January. Brenda was furious, entirely blaming me for destroying the family, but I had already blocked her number. I haven't spoken to Stephanie or my mother since that Thanksgiving. Setting that boundary was hard at first, but the peace that followed was entirely worth it. I stopped pouring my energy into a black hole of unrequited love and started pouring it into myself. By spring, I earned a massive promotion at my architecture firm. I started dating again, this time with a newfound sense of self-respect that refused to settle for anything less than I deserved. Sometimes, burning bridges is the only way to keep yourself warm. I drove 5 hours through a storm just to smash 3 pies on a porch, but I drove back home with my freedom. Family toxicity can break you down, but setting boundaries will always set you free. If you loved this crazy Thanksgiving drama and want to hear more real-life stories about standing up for yourself, dropping toxic family members, and finding your own peace, make sure you hit that like button. Share this story with anyone who needs a reminder of their worth, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more weekly story times. Drop a comment below. What would you have done with the pies?